Hi, so I'm Michelle. Today I'm going to be talking about CSS Grid. I last spoke at Bristol JS around 18 months ago, so not that long ago. So some of you might have come to that talk before. I was talking about CSS Grid then. I'm talking about CSS Grid again today. There might be a little bit of overlap, but hopefully not too much. So hopefully there'll still be some new things to learn as well. Last time I think I managed to get 2 lines of JavaScript into my talk. This talk has 0 lines of JavaScript. There's no JavaScript at all. It's just CSS. So I'm sorry you've come to a JavaScript meetup to learn about CSS. But yay, CSS is great. Before I start my talk, I like to ask a couple of questions. How many of you have heard of CSS Grid Layout? Cool, pretty much everyone, I hope. How many of you have used CSS Grid, even just a little bit? Cool. And how many of you are using Grid in production right now? Cool, yay, some of you. Well, I hope by the end of this talk, a few more of you will feel sort of confident and hopefully inspired enough to give it a go. When I talk about CSS Grid, I mean the CSS Grid Layout specification, which is a relatively new specification for layout on the web. And although it's been around for a few years now, a recent analysis by Adam Argyle and Una Kravitz showed that roughly only 2% of websites are using Grid. So that's not insignificant because it's obviously like taking into account websites that may have been made years ago that are still around, but it does still show that Grid is in quite the early adoption phase at the moment. So who am I to be talking about CSS Grid? So I am a front-end developer at a Bristol agency called Atomic Smash as of 2 weeks ago. I'm also a Mozilla tech speaker. And I have a blog called CSS in Real Life, where I write quite a lot about my adventures with Grid and other things to do with CSS, including some of the stuff that we're going to cover here today. Now, if we take a look at a brief history of CSS Layout, from the birth of CSS until today, you can see that first of all, we had nothing much at all. We just had flow layout. You basically just get one long column. And then people figured out that you could hack around with tables to produce layouts for the web, and people started getting really creative with that. And then a few people said that this was a pretty bad idea for lots of reasons, and people stopped using tables, and we started using floats instead, which, if any of you have worked with building layouts with floats and writing clear fixes and so on, it's not really a very fun way of building a layout. It's not intuitive particularly, and the code looks quite gross. But in the intervening time, quite a few frameworks sprung up to help us with layout, so we didn't have to write stuff like that too often. And things like Bootstrap and Foundation, which many of you may have used. But then a little while later, Flexbox came along, and I think this was a pretty big moment for layout on the web, because it suddenly made working with layout so much easier. And I really love Flexbox, but Flexbox does not give us everything we need for building layouts. It's great at what it does, but now finally we have CSS Grid Layout. And I arrived at web development around here. So when most people were still using floats, but Flexbox was starting to become a thing. And I was pretty excited about where CSS Layout was headed, and I've been pretty obsessed with it ever since. So now with Grid, we finally have a tool that's fit for purpose. And if I was to go back 5 years and think about how I imagined layout should work on the web, I'd be hard-pressed to find a better solution than CSS Grid. It's the layout method I would have dreamed of. And CSS Grid is incredibly powerful, but it also can be a little bit daunting, as you have so much choice when it comes to building a layout and placing items. And it's not always easy to see how and why things go wrong. Now, I recommend using Firefox to debug your grids, and Mozilla have really invested recently in their dev tools for debugging CSS, And in particular, if you're working with layout, then the Grid Inspector and Flexbox Inspector in Firefox DevTools are really better than anything else out there. I had an issue with my local development yesterday, which meant I couldn't use Firefox for the day, and I really massively noticed the difference. So you suddenly have to go into Chrome, start counting your grid lines. It's really horrible. So use Firefox, everyone. I don't get paid by Mozilla or anything, by the way. So we're going to take a look at some of the ways that the Grid Inspector can help us in the upcoming examples. Now, I've been using Grid in production for a couple of years now. And this was one of the first websites that I built with CSS Grid. It's for Warner Brothers UK Studios. And I built it with the agency I was with at the time called Mud. They're based in Bath. So at the time that I built this, there weren't really that many articles and tutorials to do with Grid. We were just all still figuring out a lot of stuff. There weren't very many examples around at all. So that kind of got me more and more interested in Grid. I was playing around with it a lot and experimenting. And that's where a lot of my kind of findings have come from with this talk. Because since then, I've helped quite a lot of people get started with it too. And I've noticed that the same issues often come up time and time again, or a lot of people get stuck on similar things. So I want to dig into some of those issues today. But first of all, let's just take a brief look at some of the different ways that you could build a layout with Grid. Now, I like to think of using Grid as two parts. And then the first part is the scaffolding, actually building the structure onto which you place your items. And these are the properties acting on the grid container. So here we're defining a 4x4 grid. So it has 4 column tracks and 4 row tracks, and it has a 1 rem gap between each of the tracks using the gap property, which is an alias for grid gap. You can use kind of either syntax. I think, well, grid gap is kind of the previous one, but now gap is pretty well supported now. So now we have an empty grid, but it's invisible unless we inspect it in the browser. So this screenshot shows what our grid looks like with the Firefox Grid Inspector turned on. And we can take a look at that now. So I have the DevTools panel open on the right-hand side. And this second panel down houses our Layout tab, which is the one that we need to debug our layouts. And that houses the Flexbox Inspector and the Grid Inspector. And the Grid Inspector will show you any grids that are on your page with their corresponding class names. And it has this little checkbox to toggle them on and off. So straight away, you'll be able to see your grid with these lines for the gaps and everything else. And then we have this little map of our grid, and if we hover over any of the cells here, then we get the computed track size in a little bubble over the grid cells. We also have these checkboxes on the right, and the first one is to display the line numbers. So as the name would suggest, that shows you the line numbers along the top and the sides of your grid. And then we'll come back to the other ones shortly. So now we need to place some items on our grid. So we want to place this image in the top left-hand quadrant of our grid, so up against the first grid line. So there are a number of different ways we can place this item on our grid. And the first way is to use a start line and an end line number. So we're doing that using the grid row and the grid column properties. We're giving them both a start line and an end line. We could also use a start line and a span value. So instead of specifying an end line, we can say we want this item to span 2 rows and 2 columns. Or we could use span and an end line. And sometimes it's easier to place items by end line rather than start line. Or in this case, because this is the only item that we're placing on our grid and we want to place it against the first grid line, then we could just use span and auto placement. So if we don't specify a start or end line, then Grid will place this item up against the very first grid line that is available on both axes. And that works in this instance because we haven't got any other items in our grid. But if we wanted to place this item somewhere else on the grid, then we couldn't rely on auto placement. We would have to specify a start or end line. And all of the previous examples are just different ways of placing this item in exactly the same position on the grid. And there's no right or wrong way, and you can mix and match them as much as you like. We could also use named grid lines to place our item. So here I'm defining two line names, image start and image end, on the row axis in the grid template rows property. And we can use any name we like, but if we suffix that line name with start and end, then we get a grid area, which we can just reference in our grid row property. Instead of saying image start / image end, we can just say, place this in the grid area called image on the row axis. And even better, if we do the same thing on the column axis, then that creates an area like this. So it's the equivalent to naming our lines on both axes, and that area is now called image. So then we can just reference that entire area with the grid area property, instead of using grid row and grid column. And that's the equivalent to doing this. So grid area is shorthand for grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, and grid column end. But I think giving it a named area is kind of much easier to read. And there is one more way to create grid areas, and that's with the grid template areas property, which basically lets us draw the areas of our grid with text. So I'm using the letter I to create an area called I instead of using the whole word image, but I could write the whole word image if I wanted to, or name that line, name that area whatever I like. There is a limitation with grid template areas, and that's that you can't place overlapping items. So suppose I have this second grid item. We have this block with our cupcake recipe on the right-hand side. So I want to place this in the bottom right quadrant, overlapping the first item by one grid cell. And I can't do that with grid template areas alone. But what I could do is name grid lines for the image using grid template rows and grid template columns. And then I could name the area for the text block in the grid template areas property. So there's nothing to stop you mixing those two together. Now, if we go over to the grid inspector again, and toggle on our grid here, the second checkbox is display area names. And that will light up any named grid areas that you have in your grid. So because I've defined this grid area called text, that shows the word text in every grid cell that encompasses that area. And that will show even if there's no item in that grid cell. The image, I actually have created a grid area with the grid template rows and grid template columns property. For some reason, the grid inspector doesn't handle that in the same way, and it doesn't show the named grid area. But if I hover over any of these cells, the whole area does light up. So the inspector is aware that that is a grid area. It's just for some reason it doesn't show it in the same way. Cool, so we've covered quite a lot of different ways to build a grid and place items. And I want to show you a quick example of how some of these placement methods can work together. My son recently came home with the class bear from preschool. And we had to take it on adventures and put all our adventures in this scrapbook, which I had quite a lot of fun doing, as you can see. And obviously my next thought after building this scrapbook is, but can I create it in CSS Grid? And the answer is yes. So this is the layout I built based on my child's preschool scrapbook. Not photos of my child here. I'm a great photographer. If we just, let me turn the inspector on. If I toggle the grid on here, so you can see straight away that it's a much more complex grid than the previous example. So we have lots and lots of rows and columns, and we have items overlapping each other all the way down the page. So it might not always be so obvious how you would go about building something like this. If I go over to the code here, bit. So if I go down to where I'm actually placing the items, so this is how I'm placing the images in this block here. And you can see I'm using two different placement methods. So on the column axis with the grid column properties, I'm using a mixture of start and end lines and span values. And on the row axis, I'm using named grid areas. And there are a couple of reasons why I chose to do that. So in this layout, if we go back to the actual layout a moment, the way I was building it, I wanted to be able to add new items to the layout and to be able to control them quite easily, like maybe shift an item like 1 or 2 rows to the left or right. So on the column axis, it didn't make very much sense to me to use named grid areas, because then every time I wanted to move an item to try and perfect my layout, I would have to go into the grid template columns property and like shift around that line name. And that seemed to me to be more trouble than it was worth. So by using line numbers, that's very easy for me to shift an item to the left or to the right by 1 column. Whereas on the row axis, all the items are overlapping each other, and we have lots and lots of rows in the grid. If we have a look at this little map of the grid, you can see we have all these rows all the way down the page, if you have a look at the map on the right-hand side. So I decided that using named grid lines or named grid areas was a kind of better way to do that for me. And the other thing I like about that is that I can actually line up my grid template rows property so that it mirrors the layout of the page. All of those grid rows are actually echoed in the page layout. And that made it much easier for me to place items. I'm not going to go into every single property here because I'm using like custom properties and all sorts. But we'll cover some of those maybe later on. You hopefully get an idea of how some of the different layout methods or layout placement methods can work together. There's not always a clear-cut solution, and there's never a right or wrong way. It's just what works for you at the time. So I quite often start building a layout in a certain way and then switch things up halfway through when it becomes clear to me that something isn't quite working the way I want it to. Now, we don't always have to explicitly position every item on our grid. If we don't place items, then they'll be auto-placed, which means they'll each be placed into the first available grid cell, filling up 1 row before moving on to the next one. And that's assuming that we're using the default grid auto flow value of row. If we switch that grid auto flow value to column, then they'll fill up by column instead. So we have a grid of 3 rows here, defined by the grid template rows property. Now, if there aren't enough rows in our grid for the number of items that we want to place in it, then grid is pretty clever. It will simply create new rows for us. And we call these implicit tracks. So implicit tracks are any tracks that are outside of the explicitly defined grid area. And we can control the size of those tracks with the grid auto rows property, or grid auto columns if you're on the column axis. So if you have maybe something like a news feed and you don't know how many items are going to be in your layout, then you might want to leave the grid auto rows value as the default auto value, because you might want those newly created rows to be sized to the content. Whereas if we have maybe something like this image gallery, we might want any newly created rows to have the same fixed height, so that our gallery will be uniform all the way down. So implicit tracks are really useful if we want to build something like this, but they sometimes trip us up if we don't mean to create them. And that's the first problem that I want to talk about, accidental implicit tracks. So let's say we want to place this red item in our on our grid, and I've put some content in there as well. So we want to place it on the 3rd grid line with a span of 2 column tracks. So it goes right up against the last line of our grid. Now, if we accidentally gave that item a span of 3, then it would create an implicit track because there aren't enough column tracks in our grid. And because we've put some text content inside that item, we can quite clearly see that implicit track has been created on the right. But if we don't have any content inside that grid item, so maybe it just has a background image or a background color, then the implicit track will have a width of 0 because there's nothing creating that extra width. But you might be able to see there's something a little bit off about your grid, or perhaps it's causing overflow somewhere, because there'll actually be this extra little gutter width on the right. So if you have this problem where things don't seem to be exactly as they should be with your grid, then what you can do is check the line numbers in the grid inspector. And if the line numbers are higher than you would expect, then the chances are you've created implicit tracks without meaning to. And in some cases, it can completely throw your layout off or cause items to disappear altogether. So I'll show you a slightly different example. My friend had 2 items that he wanted to place on a grid like this. So each one spans 2 rows, and they have a 1-row overlap. And this was the CSS that he used to place those items. And on first glance, this seems like it should work. So each item spans 4 columns. The image starts at grid line 1 on the row axis and spans 2 rows. And the text block starts at grid line 2 and also spans 2 rows. So that seems like it should do what we want it to. But how come what happens is this? If we turn on the grid inspector, and we can see that implicit tracks have been created. So rather than fill the explicit grid by overlapping those items, the browser is attempting to place them in a way that avoids overlap by creating implicit tracks. So if you want to overlap items on your grid, then you explicitly need to say that grid won't overlap items unless you tell it to. So we can avoid this by explicitly placing those items on both axes. So we're going to give them a start line as well as a span value. And this would be a great cause for using negative grid lines. So we want both items to span the full width of the grid. So negative grid lines are basically your grid flipped around. So line 1 is the very first line of the grid, line -1 is the very last line. So if you wanted to place an item up against this last line, you could use line 5, or you could also use -1. Both of those will work. And the same with line 1, that will also be grid line -5, because there are 5 lines in our grid. And I find using negative grid lines really, really useful. So this way, if we wanted this item to span the full width of the grid, we could still create more columns at different breakpoints, and we wouldn't need to reposition that item. It would still span the full width of the grid. But there is a limitation with negative grid lines, and that's that they only apply to the explicit grid. If you're relying on implicit tracks, then negative grid lines won't work. So if we go back to our autoflow example, we created 3 explicit grid rows, but that last row is an implicit track because that's created just when we have more content in our grid, and grid's creating those extra rows. But line -1 isn't the last line of the grid, it's going to be always the 4th line down, no matter how many extra rows are created through implicit tracks. Now, you might have noticed in some of the previous examples, we sized our grid tracks using fixed units, so rems in this case. And that might be what we want in some cases, but often on the responsive web, we want flexible grids. So we can use the FR unit or fraction unit. So using the FR unit, there's very little need for calc or percentage sizing when it comes to sizing your grid tracks. Tracks sized with the FR unit take up a proportion of the space in the grid container. So they respond to leftover space the way that flex items fill space in a flex container. So the FR unit takes your gutters, your length-based tracks, and any fixed tracks into account, and it distributes the remaining space accordingly. So we could use the FR unit in the grid template columns property to create 4 equal width tracks, 4 flexible column tracks. and they all take up an equal proportion of the available space. So that's pretty cool, as it means we've created 4 equal width tracks with a very simple line of code. Or that's what we might expect, but that actually doesn't necessarily mean equal width tracks. So FR units are flex units, not length-based units, and they'll respond to fill the available space. So if we want one column to be twice the width of the others, we could make that column 2 FR and the others 1 FR. Or we could make one column a fixed size, like 15 rems, say, and the rest of the tracks will distribute the remaining space between them. So between this example and the previous one, we can already see that tracks sized as 1 FR are not necessarily the same. Their size depends on the context. So let's keep them as 1 FR for now. And now let's put some content in those tracks. So we've got paragraphs of different lengths here, and the last grid item I've deliberately left empty. And you might wonder why I've highlighted certain words here, and hopefully you'll see in a moment. If we change the width of the viewport, watch what happens to each of those tracks. So they end up at different widths. Each one is sized to the longest word inside that grid item. And the last track collapses right down to 0. And in fact, it would be invisible if it wasn't for that border. So why is that? FR tracks are both extrinsically and intrinsically sized. So by extrinsic sizing, we mean their size is determined by the context. So that's the available space, any fixed track values, and any gap values. And by intrinsic sizing, we mean their size is determined by the content. So both of these things are acting on our FR tracks to resolve the computed size. If the content in each column was the same, then yes, we would get 4 equal width tracks. But if one of our grid items has content that's much larger, like this second item here, which has this really large word in it, then the grid's column will grow and expand to fit the content. So this is great because grid is responding to our content and avoiding breaking the layout. But perhaps that's not what we want. So perhaps we want our columns to be the same width no matter what. And there are reasons why you might do that. So it might be part of a page-wide grid system. What we need to do instead is use grid's MinMax function. So with MinMax, we pass in a minimum and a maximum size for our grid tracks. And by setting a minimum of 0 or any fixed length, we can lock those tracks into growing at the same rate, even if the content is larger or smaller. Now, if we go over to the grid inspector again for a moment, we have this last option on the right to extend grid lines indefinitely. If we toggle that one on, then you'll see our grid lines go all the way up and down our page. And this is really useful because if you have lots of components on your page that use the same grid and you want them all to line up with each other, then you can straight away see if something is pushing one of your grids out of alignment because those tracks then won't line up with each other anymore. Now, I want to look at a problem that isn't quite solved with the level 1 grid specification, but it will be with level 2, and that's alignment between grid items. So grid gives us access to a lot of different alignment properties, some of which you might recognize from Flexbox. And no one ever remembers what they all do, so it's compulsory to try out every single one until you find the one that does the thing that you want. Now, by default, items will stretch to fill the grid cell, like with Flexbox. They have an align items value of stretch. Or we could use align items with a value of center to have all our content line up nicely in the center of each grid cell, because vertical centering is witchcraft, as we all know. Now, grid and Flexbox are not mutually exclusive, and combining them is often really, really useful. So say we have these items in our grid, and each one has 2 children. It has a bit of text, and it has a link at the bottom. We could make the top item, or so the heading of each one, line up to the top of each grid cell, and we could make the bottom item or the link line up to the bottom of each grid cell by using Flexbox. So we'd make each item a flex item with a flex direction of column, and we could either use justify content with a value of space between, or we could use a top margin of auto on our links there to push them right down to the bottom of the grid cell, or the grid item. But what if these cards have another child element? So they have a heading, they have a paragraph of text, and they have the link there. Well, what might be a little bit nicer is if all the headings lined up with each other, and all the paragraphs of text line up with each other, and all the links line up with each other too. So something like this. But there's currently no way to do that using Grid and Flexbox as they are. Those items, the contents of those items don't have any awareness of each other. They all exist in their own little contextual bubble. But this is where Subgrid will come in useful. And Subgrid is part of the level 2 specification. And it allows grid items to inherit the parent grid. So we can use the grid template columns and grid template rows properties to specify which axis we want to inherit the grid of the parent. So in this case, it would be the row axis. And this is how we do it. So we make each item now span 3 rows. Each item now becomes a grid in itself. And we give it a value of subgrid for the grid template rows property. And now those items will inherit the parent grid on the row axis. So Subgrid is currently behind a flag in Firefox, but it will be supported with the next release of Firefox, which is Firefox 70, I think. Currently, I don't think there are any plans for any of the other browsers to follow suit. Hopefully they will do pretty soon, because I think this is probably a bit of a game changer for a lot of people using Grid. But we're definitely in progressive enhancement territory right now. Now, as much power as Grid gives us, it's not the solution to everything. And it's just one tool of many. So I'm a big fan of using the right layout method for the right purpose. And here are some scenarios where I would not use Grid. And the first one is tables. I've seen plenty of layouts built with Grid that should really be a table. And if you're rendering tabular data, you should use a table. Don't do this. And the main reason is that it renders your table inaccessible to screen readers. And you might think, well, I would never do that anyway, because then I would have to flatten my markup. But actually, Subgrid makes it more tempting to do this, because the table rows could inherit the grid of the parent, and so on. But a screen reader will not be able to read your table, so don't do it. And that applies for table rows too. And the other one is when you don't want items to align in rows and columns, which might sound kind of obvious. But I have seen examples of people using Grid where they would actually be much better served with Flexbox. So Flexbox is designed to be flexible. And perhaps we don't want such a rigid layout that Grid gives us. So maybe you've got something like a long navigation menu, and you want that to wrap onto 2 lines as the viewport gets smaller. Flexbox is perfect for that kind of scenario. Or you can have all those items nicely lined up in the center. Or perhaps when you have only one item in a line, you want that item to expand and fill the line. And this isn't really that practical to do with Grid. But it's exactly what Flexbox excels at. It's designed to be flexible. Whereas with Grid, the items will always be aligned in rows and columns. And we could make some of them span different numbers of rows and columns to give the impression of a more uneven layout, but they would still be aligned in rows and columns. But if we want some of those items to span more than one row, then we're laying things out in 2 dimensions rather than 1. So that's the perfect case to use Grid. And the last one is when your fallback layouts take twice as long. So one of the most common reasons that I hear for people not adopting Grid is browser support, or lack of. So Grid is actually really well supported, like something like 90% of all browsers support Grid, or possibly more. It might be like 92% now. But it's not supported in IE 11, IE 10, and older browsers, which still a lot of people do need to support. In fact, IE 10 and IE 11 do support Grid's older syntax, which is a prefixed version, and it doesn't have all the features of the modern spec. So I prefer to treat those browsers as if they don't support Grid at all and give them a fallback layout. And my way of doing that is to use @supports rules. So this @supports rule says if the browser does not support Grid, do this flex layout instead. But actually this is a really bad idea because IE doesn't support @supports. So this whole block will be ignored and you won't get your fallback layout. So what you need to do instead is to put your fallback first, and then you can wrap your Grid code in the @supports rule. And I would recommend providing a simpler layout for your fallbacks. If you're spending time painstakingly trying to recreate your Grid layouts using older layout methods, then that's really not good use of Grid or your time. And I think in order to truly embrace modern CSS layout, we need to let go of the idea that websites need to look the same in all browsers. And if your client or whoever you're building a website for really believes that and can't be persuaded otherwise, then it's probably not a good idea to build your entire website in Grid. You're basically doubling your workload. But there's nothing to stop you using Grid for smaller components or smaller chunks of UI. And actually, I think that can be quite a good test bed and a great way to convince other people that it's something worth investing in and exploring more. You don't have to use Grid as an all or nothing thing. And that's the great thing about it, is it's native CSS. It doesn't involve importing another dependency into your project. It costs nothing to use Grid. So thank you for listening. If you're interested in learning a bit more about Grid, I really recommend anything by Rachel Andrew or Jen Simmons. So Rachel Andrew has gridbyexample.com, where she has written probably literally hundreds of articles about Grid, really deep diving into some of the different aspects. So she is kind of the font of all knowledge in that regard. And Jen Simmons has this Layout Land YouTube channel. So if you prefer learning by video, that's definitely worth taking a look at. And if you want to know a bit more about the Firefox developer tools, there's also the Mozilla developer channel, where they talk about some of the new CSS features and how to debug those with DevTools. And lastly, this is my blog, CSS in Real Life, where I've written quite a lot of articles about Grid, including some of the stuff that I've talked about here today. So thanks for having me.
How many responsive layouts do you use when you tend to write a site?
It really depends. So the thing with Grid, especially using things like FR tracks and MinMax, is you actually I find, don't need as many breakpoints as you otherwise would, because you can build things in the way that they respond to the layout a bit better. So I haven't shown the examples here, but in another one of the talks I've done, I've shown how you can use a sort of similar layout to the Scrapbook layout, but you can actually get down to quite small screen sizes, maybe just before mobile, before the layout starts looking not right. So in that case, you probably would only need one breakpoint. I tend to go from mobile, just a stacked layout, and then initiate Grid once you get to tablet size in most cases, but you could do sort of Grid all the way down, theoretically. I mean, for the browsers that support it anyway.
Really good talk. Can you, I'm assuming you can you use nested grids?
Yes, so I wonder if I have the example. I don't think I do here, but so I'm actually using that on a project that I'm working on at the moment. Again, it's a layout where items are overlapping quite a bit, and I'm using 3 or 4 levels of grids. So Yeah, sometimes that's kind of the best approach anyway, because yeah, you want so with Subgrid that would be a bit easier because you could it still kind of is a nested grid, but it's inheriting the parent grid. Whereas now I have to do things like defining. If I want a grid that takes 5 out of 6 columns, but then I also want that to be a grid, then I have to define those 5 columns inside that grid and so on. But yeah, you can totally do that. But Subgrid will make it more pleasant to do that.
In the example that you had all equal columns, but the content was forcing them to be different widths, do the dev tools help flag out those issues at all?
Not exactly, but you can, by extending the grid lines, I think that's quite helpful if you do have multiple grids on the page. Or if you, so when you do have a grid, if you hover over any of these grid cells, then you get the computed track size in the little bubble above the grid cell. So you can see if, to your eye, you might not be sure whether something is whether your tracks are the same size or not, and that will tell you definitely whether they're the same size. But yeah, that's kind of the best way I've seen to do it.